Dory 1, this is Fireteam Delta. Dad's coming home.
Welcome to the Military Veteran Dad Podcast, where it is our mission to bring every dad home. I am your host, Ben Killoy. I'm a United States Marine veteran, husband, and a father. We will bring authentic conversations to inspire action in your life so we can close the gap between the dad you are today and the dad you want to be tomorrow. This is the Military Veteran Dad Podcast.
Welcome back to another episode of the Fatherhood Friday series. Feels good to have a name, not gonna lie. Well, if you're listening to the news, it's kind of crazy out there. So as a dad, you could be thinking a lot of different things about right now. So today, I am going to bring you an episode that focuses inward to try to help you gain the power to move through all the noise that is out there of coronavirus and everything else that's going on in your world. Because if you watch the news, even if there's not the coronavirus going on, it can be a noisy place. And as a dad that internalizes emotions, internalizes the feelings that inside of what they need to feel, when things are happening externally that you're trying to see control over, you can easily feel overwhelmed. And that overwhelm can happen very, very quickly. So today we're going to talk about going inward. And what I mean by that is, do you know who you are? And this was kind of inspired by a Podfest Expo Media conference that I went to in Orlando last week. And at the conference, and it's proven at every conference, when I show up as myself, now that I know who I am, that energy, that resonance frequency of two conversations coming together, you can't help but feel like $1,000,000. You feel validated. You feel loved. You feel understood. You feel like you are exactly who you need to be. But that wasn't always the case for me, because if you've been listening to the podcast, you know that I didn't have friends 5 years ago. So I wasn't having any conversations with anybody outside of work or any immediate people in my life. You knew that I didn't take a lot of big steps with my life. I had the feeling and desire to take big steps, but I wasn't. You know that I listened to too much information. That information helped fill the well, but it did not do anything to actually produce a result. And it was ultimately because I really didn't know who I was. And it took becoming a father. It took leaning into being a father and doing life with other dads. And if you also follow the podcast, you know that one of my very first steps that I took was I joined the Dad's Edge Alliance Mastermind in 2016. And that helped propel me into the idea and understanding of who I was, and just surrounding myself with like-minded men that were the similar growth mindset. They helped pull out the best parts of me. And so this is the part that you might be confused on if you've been trying to do this for a while. The answers you seek aren't actually on the inside. They're actually what other people give back to you. So let me explain what I'm saying. When you show up in a conversation, you have an idea of what you're maybe talking about, you're carrying it on, everything's going fine. But what someone gives you back, what someone counters your point with, or just the next sentence in your conversation, those are single little breadcrumbs that help bring up to the surface of who you are. A simple example is that a dad conference that I went to with the Dad's Edge, I went into that being the guy that shook hands. And there was probably a few times that I gave a hug, but I was a guy that shook hands. I wasn't against hugging. I just felt uncomfortable doing it. But by the end of that conference, hugging another man was something that was completely okay with me. And by the end, I became the guy that gave good hugs. That was a thing that I never walked in with, but those men helped pull that out of me. And what that also helped do is helped identify of how much of a person I am, and a person that leads with his heart. And through the next 4 years of just my own growth, through work and leadership development and everything else that I've been doing, I understood that I was a heart-centered man. I was a heart-centered leader in everything that I did. I tried to get out of my head and into my heart to really feel what was going on inside, but then also feel what other people were feeling. And it was only through going through this process of me blogging, people commenting, me posting on Facebook, people commenting, having a conversation, that I really realized that one of the best parts of me is my ability with words. It's one of the reasons why I have a podcast now, is because I recognized that and I decided to start putting the reps in those words. Those words helped me identify my next pivot. So if you remember, when I lost my job, I realized that the gift of my words was something that I wasn't honoring truly, which then made me want to leap further into being on stage, to being a paid professional public speaker. But all of this came to me almost externally. It was maybe inside, but it's extremely difficult to see your own value and worth if you're not putting out into the universe who you are so that you can have something reflected back. If you've ever invested in a coaching call with anybody, you know that this is true. So you show up in a coaching call not to figure out what childhood issues you have. You go into a coaching call to help figure out how those childhood issues are preventing you from moving forward. Coaching is about the future. Therapy is about the past. And when you focus on the future, that coach is identifying something in you that you can't see, that's currently blinded by whatever you're holding in or whatever emotion you can't see. And he's going to reach in and pull that to the surface and help that come through. So when you're thinking of how do you identify who you are, you have to think externally, not internally. So let's take this and pivot a little bit to a veteran or an active duty. So you put on this uniform that defines who you are. That uniform becomes your identity. That identity has a time clock on it. And that time clock eventually rips away. But if you didn't know who you were under that uniform, if everything that you embodied as an active duty person, whether airman, Marine, soldier, whatever branch you served, if you didn't figure out what the gold was under that uniform, when you take it off, you feel empty. Why do you feel empty? Because you no longer know what those core things are about you. You knew what people liked when you put the uniform on, but you maybe didn't spend the time to figure out what people liked when you had the uniform on. Did they like the way you speak? Did they like how you show up as a friend? Were you the friend that was always there? Did you look out for your brothers? These are things that other people valued, but maybe you weren't able to see them or feel them. But those are the things that define who you are. And so if we were to take this to being a dad, you step into the role of being a dad and you instantly have this child in your arms after birth. And you're like, this child is going to look up to me for the rest of their life. And when you think about how much I have to grow as a father to achieve that, because no one gives you a manual to raise your kid. And even if there is a manual, every kid is unique. So even if I have 3 kids, each one is a completely different manual that's being written every day. But again, as a dad, you don't really know who you are. But there's something interesting that happens with kids as you raise them. Your kids don't necessarily point out the best parts of you, but they point out some of the worst parts of you. So here's what I'm saying. When you're triggered by emotion of your kids, when something just irritates you to the core, and you know that moment I'm talking about, that moment where the house is burning down because they're just running around crazy, they're not listening, you just want them to get in the car, you just want them to get buckled, and they're not listening. That trigger, that feeling you feel inside is actually something that you need to work on. Wherever you feel triggered by your own kids know that you could have a 95% personality and saying like, you know what, I walk on water. I am 2 steps below Jesus. But your kids will find that 5%, that you didn't know about, and they'll push that button. And they'll keep pushing it and pushing it. And you're like, why do my kids drive me nuts? Well, I wonder if it's maybe that they're pushing that button and what triggers you is actually more about you than it is about them. And they've just have a brilliant gift to expose our weaknesses. They find the one hole in your insecurity firewall that they can keep pushing. And once they find out they can get you to react, that's what your kids are trying to do. When they get you to react, that's the ultimate goal. And so when you get triggered, they get triggered. And if they're not already triggered, then they're even more triggered. But when you focus on who you are, your kids often give you the gift of who you're not, or what you're scared of as well. So when you think of coaching through kids, all of these things, fatherhood is one of the best vehicles to understand this, because especially if you adopt the principles we talk about on this podcast of understanding how you have friends in your life, that you need to have a group of men to do life together. If you adopt the principles that you need strong leaders in your life to lead your life forward, that you need someone that you're measuring life against, that am I living the bar up against? Do you have the idea that every day you wake up, you try to create a legacy that redefines how your last name is remembered? Those things matter. And if you're doing all of those things, being a strong dad, showing up to your kids will give you that final gift of those final areas that you need to work on. Because when you focus on those areas and learn not to be triggered, this crazy thing starts happening. Your kids stop doing it. And then you have this kind of peace and calming that happens where you can actually have kind of a calm household for maybe a day. Now, I'm not selling unicorns and rainbows with this, because let me tell you, even when you do get an area under control, they're still going to try pushing new buttons. But if you can get to a space where those triggers aren't happening, then you can get to a space where you can be almost truly masculine in that space with your kids. Because we've talked about it in last month or in January on the podcast about masculine energy and feminine energy. And if you can get to a space where those emotions that your kids are bringing you and they're trying to trigger you and they don't trigger you, well, then all you need to do is just hug them. Just give them that big bear hug and let them scream, let them kick, but let them just get all of that emotion out. They don't know how to process emotions any better than you do. You have some coping techniques or even just some basic suppression mechanisms that we've been programmed with as a society. Your kids don't. So if you can figure out how to just show up untriggered by figuring out the things you don't know about, that allows you to show up in the masculine energy to just feel the wind that is whatever your kids are bringing you. Give them a big hug and say that I love you, because love conquers all, but it doesn't conquer all. You can't bring love if you feel triggered inside, because if they're triggering an insecurity, then you feel inconfident or incapable of leading your kids in that moment. So let's circle back to the beginning of what we talk about, figuring out who you are. That step one, you need to be able to have conversations with people in an enriched environment where people are going to gift you back that feedback of what sticks, what works, and what really resonates. I can't tell you, you know about it when you're listening to this podcast, there'll be something I say. If you're listening to other podcasts, there'll be something they say. You'll pick that one golden nugget out of a book. Those resonance frequencies identify who you are. And in a future episode, we'll talk about some core value stuff, which are important of who you are. But understanding your personality and where it resonates of who you are, that identity. My identity is a heart-centered person that wears their heart on their sleeve. I have a deep empathy for the people that come into my world, and I am always trying to help them. Even at PodFest, I probably gift away 10 different podcast ideas during a conversation, because in a conversation, I show up as a very giving person. And it's that giving person that defines that who it is I am. It becomes my identity. It's something that I really enjoy, gifting energy to people and breathing life into them when they don't see it themselves. But I only got that way because I kept having conversations. So when you're thinking about figuring out who you are, because you've taken the uniform off, maybe if you're a veteran listening to this, focus on when you have conversations with people. What do you really, truly enjoy about that conversation? Another easy way to reflect backwards on some experiences without maybe starting a whole bunch of new conversations. What things in your life, what roles, what leadership roles, what events did you partake in that you truly enjoyed? I'll give you an example from my life. So I was a corporal on the way out of the Marine Corps, and in that last 6 months, we were rotating through corporals as platoon sergeant. And so for 3 months, I got to be platoon sergeant. And that identified one core leadership trait that I love. And it essentially is how I show up even today. It gave me that gift as I look backwards. It probably took 10 years for me to be able to see that guidance of that moment. But nevertheless, that moment was still there. And what that moment gave me was I loved taking Marines that people had labeled shitbags and given up on, and people were just unfit to wear the title type mindsets. And taking those Marines, reaching down inside them, finding the pieces that I could see that they couldn't see, and pulling them up. And as you remember earlier, I just gave that as a definition of a coach, which is why I like the idea of coaching people on what they can't see, because everybody has things they can't see. And if this episode is resonating with you and you want help to understand what it is that you are and who you are, I would love to set up a coaching call with you, give 30 minutes of just identifying and showing up in your life in a very powerful way, in a very heart-centered way. And so if this is interesting to you, go ahead and go to militaryveterandad.com/call, and that'll go ahead and we'll get set up, and you can take 30 minutes, and I would love to connect with you and understand who you are and help gift you the gift of those core values. I can't tell you how many calls I've had in the last few months, especially since losing my job, where just showing up as myself has been one of the most exciting things that I do every day. But let me tell you, that was a long journey, but it took many conversations, many things to identify, many coaches coming to my life to identify that these are the things that make Ben Killoy, Ben Killoy. And once you figure out your secret sauce, then you just need to show up as that person in the universe every single day. And if you've ever heard the law of attraction, that's where the law of attraction comes into play, because when you show up as your raw, unauthentic self or authentic self and show up with vulnerability and everything that is who you are, that's when the universe starts bringing the people in your life that can truly transform it. And I can say in the last 2 weeks between Dad 2.0 and Podfest, that has been exactly what has been transpiring for me. So with that, I'm going to sign off, and I will talk to you again on Monday.